Good morning and welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I always say good morning just instinctually because it's morning here in California and it's actually a pretty nice day. But it occurs to me that that is not recognizing how many of you are joining us from other parts of the country. I noticed Debbie from Atlanta was one of the first ones on today. We've got folks from New York, folks from DC. When we first started this about what was it, maybe 6 weeks ago, we were primarily a California group, but indeed we've become truly a nationwide group of all types of schools. We have primarily independent K-12 schools on the line, but we interestingly also have a pretty good chunk of charter schools on the line, and then some preschools and some higher ed organizations as well. And so to everybody that's on the call with us today, wherever you might be, welcome and thank you for spending this time with us today. My name is Chris Joffe. I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services, and I'm going to lead us through our conversation today. I apologize for my voice. I'm a little congested, and I'm not worried about it yet, but and I've taken my temperature, but I recognize that my voice will sound a little bit funky. So apologies for that. We are going to get started today, and as we've done over the last few weeks, I want to just kind of do a quick round of housekeeping before we actually dive in. We've cleaned this slide up just a little bit. Thank you, David, for that feedback. And essentially, we've got a rough outline of what our weeks will look like over the course of, well, the next few weeks at least. We are doing a weekly email on Thursday or on Friday, and that email will come out with the information and thoughts that we have for the week ahead. Hopefully another opportunity to check in, to give you some feedback about what might be coming around the corner. And then any templates or resources that would be valuable, at least that we think would be valuable for all of our schools. And just as a quick heads up, or maybe a reminder for some, that Thursday email or Friday morning email will go to everybody in our entire network. That's almost 20,000 schools around the country and actually another couple hundred around the world. On Mondays, we're holding this call at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. And this call is really the opportunity to dive in, to dig into some of the questions that have come up. We're finding that our biggest day of questions is actually Saturdays. And so Monday's conversation, those questions are fresh off the press. We've gotten back to hopefully all of you by then. And we'll use this time to dig into some of the most common questions. And I'll do exactly that today. For those that want updates and information throughout the week, we invite you to follow me on Twitter. My handle is Joffe Chris. And you can follow me there. I'm posting a few times a day, typically. And so you're obviously welcome to join me there. And for those who are not so Twitter inclined, you're more than welcome to email us at support@joffeemergencyservices.com. However you choose to get in touch with us, our aim is that if you ask a question by Sunday, we will answer you by Monday. And if you ask a question by Wednesday, we will answer you by Thursday. That's not to say that those are the only times you can ask questions, of course. We are here for you 24/7, but it is to say that we're trying to be as responsive as we possibly can. Many questions we're finding are being answered in minutes, but certainly they will be answered in no more than a day or so. So with that update, I suppose the one other bit of housekeeping, because we have some relatively newer folks on the line with us today, the one other bit of housekeeping I want to offer is that throughout our conversation on Mondays, although we have an agenda and we have some questions that we've kind of predetermined that we definitely want to talk through, I also want to invite folks to ask questions through the question panel. So those of you that today is your first call with us, you will get to see this. This question panel is probably the most active of any webinar that we've ever done. We will ask questions, you will ask questions, folks will share resources. It's actually really incredible. And so by and large, I think that is the strength of this call. It's the fact that it's not just one voice, but it is truly the hundreds and hundreds of voices of those of you that are on the call with us. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions. Our general sort of routine is that we'll answer the most pressing questions by 10 o'clock Pacific, and then we'll stick on the line for another 20 to 30 minutes or so, asking some of those really unique questions. And certainly I expect that today we'll have at least a handful of those, given some of the topics that we have lined up for you. So having said all of that, before we actually jump into the content, I do want to invite everybody to take a slow, deep breath. And somebody pointed out to me last week that I always tell everybody to take that deep breath in, and I often forget to tell you that it's okay to exhale too. So you can go ahead and exhale whenever you're ready. We start this call this way because I think, pandemics, emergencies, really, school-based stuff when it comes up as a whole can be really scary. And in particular, in this event, we're seeing such a high volume of news and coverage and fights and this and that. And it's exhausting, and it can be overwhelming, and it can almost be paralyzing if we're not careful. And so my hope is that this is not the only deep breath that you take throughout the week, but that this is maybe the first one, at least for those of you where it's still morning. And my hope is that you'll actually use this and continue to take deep breaths throughout the week when you're faced with those new crises, new challenges, new issues that could otherwise be overwhelming. My hope is too that this helps keep you grounded, because at the end of the day, the most important thing that you can do, I think, is to make sure that you're building a sustainable response for yourself and your leadership team. It is so important in this particular response that we put our own mask on first, both literally and figuratively, and ensure that we're keeping ourselves grounded, that we're keeping ourselves operating at a capacity that we can keep up. Because as we've talked about throughout this entire response, this is absolutely a marathon and not a sprint. And so we've got to make sure that not just we, but also our leadership teams, and I would say now the community as a whole, are doing what's necessary to take care of ourselves and to keep ourselves sort of ready and forward moving throughout the rest of this response. So with that, we'll jump into some of the things that we anticipate this week. Many of you have seen the news and seen the press conferences and what have you. And I think, regardless of how any one of us might feel about how the government is leading this situation, federal, state, county, city, whatever level might be doing well or might not be doing well in your particular neighborhood, I think it is to be expected that there are some divisive perspectives that are starting to grow and possibly really starting to kind of boil over. Certainly in Colorado and a couple other states throughout the country, we're seeing these folks that are saying it's time to move back from social distancing and return to normal now. And so many folks of all backgrounds are saying it's not time yet. And whether we agree with either of those perspectives or not, and frankly, my purpose in sharing this today is not to take one side or the other. But what I would say is that I think when we start to see that happen in the news and our parents start to see that happen, it creates this additional layer of angst, anxiety, of pressure. And sometimes that comes out as anger. Sometimes it comes out as frustration. Sometimes it comes out as sort of insulating oneself. And so people get quiet. And what I'm hopeful that we can do as a school community is not necessarily influence or change that, but be aware of it, be mindful of it, and sort of incorporate it into our thinking and our planning and our work forward. I think one of the points that I have tried to stick to time and time again throughout this response is that we can reasonably forecast about 2 to 3 weeks out. In different parts of our country, that's getting harder and harder now. I'll talk a little bit about something that's happening locally in just a few minutes, but different parts of our country, of course, are now starting to respond and react differently, and that'll make these conversations a little bit more challenging because parts of our country will be returning sooner than other parts of our country, and so we'll have to kind of work through some of that together. But I also think that for you at the really, really local level, you will also have to work through some of that together with your community. And again, the way that I choose to approach it is not necessarily to take one side or the other, because it's just not in the best interest of the sort of community as a whole, I don't think, but instead to just acknowledge that both of those things are real, both of those things are happening, and we are going to choose to move forward in the way that we're going to choose to move forward in. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I do think that as we work through the next couple of weeks and as some folks reopen, that we are going to see what is probably going to be characterized as alarming failures. And so what I mean by that is, I think when you reopen a community, whether it's a county or a city or a single neighborhood block, what's going to happen is people are going to start to interact with one another. And we've talked about this a little bit since the start, but I want to be really, really clear about it now. We're going to see what I call the fishbowl syndrome, which is essentially where people who have not interacted with others over the course of the last 5 weeks start to interact with one another, and they're going to catch a cold. And that very well may be what's happened to me, although I didn't interact with anybody. So I still have to figure out how I got this thing. But all to say that when folks first interact with and become exposed to one another's germs, it is only natural for people to get sick. It will happen and it'll be scary because we won't quite know what it is. And my push to everybody would be, when you start to experience that, take a slow, deep breath, work through it, and try to sort of reconcile the facts that we do know. We know that that's a reality. In fact, we even could go so far as to say that we know that there will be some coronavirus exposures as a result of that repopulation. So although it might look urgent, it might look reactive, or it might look responsive as we're watching it on the news or as we're experiencing it in our area, it's really part of the plan. It's something that we know is going to happen. And so again, I don't necessarily suggest that there's anything that we can do at the school level to manage for that. But I do want to say that if we incorporate it into our thinking, and if we can be really acutely aware of it as part of our planning, I think we can be stronger for it. And I think we can create a little bit more resilience within our own leadership team, with our own faculty and staff, and maybe within the entire community. And I think the last, as we've done in the last few weeks, we've always tried to end on students. I think the last bit of sort of, I don't know, thinking ahead for this week, if you will, would be that I think students are going to be particularly afraid and uncertain. I think there's so much angst that's happening at the parent level, at the faculty and staff level, that's really something that we should be on the lookout for this week. And again, I'm not sure that there's much that we can do because there's so much in the ecosystem around them that might be causing it. But it is to say, let's keep an eye out for it. And if it reaches a level that would trigger us to do something about it, then let's be equipped and prepared to do something. And if we're not quite sure what we would do about it yet, well, this is sort of a spur to you to have that conversation and to make that decision about how you might reach out and support students who might be anxious. And last but not least, I also think there is the other side of the coin where students will continue to be resilient and just incredibly innovative and sort of enthusiastic about this new paradigm that they're in. We've seen students that have started to talk about doing graduation through a virtual graduation, but using the news as the platform to share it. We've seen a couple of news stations in different parts of the country who have started to publicize that they're going to be essentially doing just that, sharing pictures or experiences that students may have, depending on the age and depending on the type of school and what the school deems appropriate. This could look 1,000 different ways, but certainly there are opportunities like that that are starting to unfold. We've seen students who have come together to use robots. This is a true story, you can't make this stuff up, but use robots to do food distribution. That they've created these robots in an idea lab or a makerspace of some sort, and they are using them to get food out in a way that is relatively safer and certainly safer for the people on the food distribution end. And so I just want to call that out, that again, it's so easy as adults for us to be worried and anxious about all that's happening. And I don't want to undermine or take that away, because that's real and that's part of what we're experiencing. But students have this different perspective, this sort of enthusiasm for what they're experiencing in many cases. And so I want to call that out as something to be looking for as well. We have borrowed this paradigm from the California Association of Independent Schools, and I won't belabor it today, but I do just want to share it for those that haven't seen it yet, this idea that there are things that we have to do now. There are things that we cannot avoid that just must happen. And so let's prioritize those, let's tackle those, let's work through those in whatever way is appropriate. And we'll talk through some of that today. There are things that are impacting the next 2 weeks. And so let's prioritize those next. And then there's a whole bunch that goes into what our future will look like. And again today, as I did last week, I'm going to lean into that space a little bit because I think for many of you that are on the call, we have to. I think for many of you, if we chose not to keep leaning forward a little bit further, maybe than our locus of control, it would actually sort of have the opposite of the effect that we're trying to have. We're trying to do confidence building and sort of strategy building and creating some perspectives and some scenarios for everybody to operate from. And that sort of forces us to look ahead a little bit further. But I do want to call out the fact that when we look at this later bucket, we're looking with imperfect data, we're looking with guesses, no matter how great they might be. Even at the federal level, they're typically just guesses about what's going to happen next. And so I want to sort of caution everybody not to take anything in the later bucket, whether it's things that we've talked about on these calls or things that you might hear the federal, state, or local government talking about, or things that a parent who's also a physician may say, right? Anything that is talked about that falls into this later category, that's more impacting a time that's more than 2 to 4 weeks out from now. Let's take it all with a grain of salt. Let's not sort of adopt it as doctrine, and let's really try to bake it into our minds into these different scenarios. And that's something that we'll talk a little bit about later today as well. And so again, if there's one push that you hear from today, my hope is that everybody can cause action and cause decisions for what's going to be happening in the next 2 weeks. But realistically, I know that not all of us can stay limited to that for a variety of really good reasons. And so let's just be careful and let's be thoughtful about those things that are going to impact a time that's further ahead than that. So in the now, and this is not a new slide, you've seen this before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but everybody should continue our social distancing. I do want to call out that we are seeing across the country kind of varying levels of this. And I wouldn't say that there's any one type of school or any one age group or anyone else who is or isn't dealing with, well, what would I say? I guess what I would say is this. Many of us are really embracing social distancing, and through the fatigue and through the challenges, we're continuing to embrace it. Others of us are finding ourselves fatigued and finding ourselves sort of not embracing social distancing as well as we could, not distancing at all in some cases, not wearing masks at all in some cases, starting to have teachers come back to campus a little bit more often than we probably ought to. And what I want to challenge everybody on the call to do is to remember that until our area has been released from social distancing, not only is it essentially law for us to keep our social distancing up, but it's also a really, really positively impactful strategy for our community. If we find and when we find a positive test case within our community, one of the action items that we have to do is we have to quarantine everybody who might have been exposed to that person for somewhere between 7 and 14 days. And typically it's on the higher end of that. And so by sort of maintaining our social distancing expectations, by continuing to lean in even through the fatigue, we're preventing ourselves from having to deal with that or embrace that challenge later on down the road. And now is a particularly important time to do this, because if we do find that we can start to think about reopening in the next couple of weeks, or we do find that we can start to think about resuming some form of on-campus education or at least operations in the next couple of weeks, those are people who would not be able to participate. Anybody who is quarantined wouldn't be able to participate until the end of their quarantine. And so if for no other reason than to ensure the best possible continuity strategy, I really want to remind everybody that social distancing is here for right now, and it's our obligation to keep doing it. To that end, there are some strategies that some of our schools have come up with, including staggering staff. So they've created these different teams on campus, maybe team 1 and team 2, or team 1, team 2, team 3. And essentially, they're not allowing people from different teams to interact throughout the day or throughout the weeks even. What I mean by that is they might have team 1 work on Monday through Friday of this week, and then team 2 work on campus Monday through Friday of next week. And that way, if there is a positive test result within that community, within team 1 or within team 2, we don't necessarily need to work so hard to quarantine that group, but let me rephrase that. We don't necessarily need to quarantine the entire community. We need to quarantine just to the group that was exposed to that person. And so again, we're creating this kind of increased layer of resilience, this increased level of redundancy, so that if and when there's a response that's needed, we shrink the population that we have to respond with and for. So I wanted to call that out as an option. Again, it's not something new, but there are enough of you that are newer to this call that I wanted to name it for both you and as maybe a reminder for everybody else. Of course, we've talked about masks quite a bit, and the general consensus right now is do wear masks, non-medical masks, non-N95 masks. And for most of us throughout the country, that's actually an expectation regardless of whether we're at school or at home or at the grocery store. For most, the local governments have said you need to wear them at any time that you're out of your home. And then of course, on the community end, I think it's important that we now start to incorporate the community in our conversation around self-care and our conversation around sort of keeping people poised for the long term or poised for the long run, because I think more and more we're starting to see the community level folks fatigue. So parents that are getting tired, parents who are starting to think about what it means to go back to work, things like that. And so I want to just encourage folks to start to have this conversation about self-care and about this idea that we're in a marathon, not a sprint, beyond the leadership team, which is sort of the group we were focused on at the very beginning of this. And I think it's now time to widen that audience to maybe everybody in your community, maybe just part of your community. I think that's a decision you'll make, but certainly to a wider audience than we had initially recommended. And here's another hopefully useful paradigm. You know, we have these three buckets, and they're ordered from top to bottom on the screen, which I think in some ways signifies that one is worse than the other, and that's not the intent. But really, there are three different strategies that we are learning to use. And so I put quotes around normal, this idea that we had normal education before, and then I'll skip the center for a second. We're doing currently some form of virtual education for most of us, maybe all of us. If you're not doing virtual education, feel free to chime in and let me know. And then there's this middle bucket that's full of question marks. And interestingly, 5 weeks ago, the virtual education bucket would have been full of question marks, but you have managed to solve for those. You've managed to determine some strategy forward in that virtual education bucket. And so first, kudos. And second, I think we have to do that yet again. As we start to work forward and we start to think about what our summer will look like or what our re-entry to school might look like, whether it's in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, we're having to sort of reassess what are those things that are going to be the same and what are those things that are going to be different. Last week, we talked about a couple of scenarios. We're going to show those scenarios again today. And one of the big takeaways that we heard was those are different. Those are scary. Those are not what we expected. And I don't want to suggest that those are the only two scenarios. In fact, we're still working on coming up with some others. Thank you to Valentina, who's going to connect us to a couple of the schools in Asia and in Italy so that we can learn a little bit about what their experiences were like as they returned. So again, I don't want to suggest that those are the only paths forward, because indeed there are probably hundreds of different ways that we could return. And in fact, I think we're going to see hundreds of different ways that different schools choose to return. What I do want to say is that there's some blend of kind of what we had previously and what we have now. And I think each community is going to have to make those determinations around which parts come with us now from kind of the old days and which parts we have to recreate or reinvent or determine for ourselves for the future and for what I'll call for now the new days. And so what I want to encourage folks to do is to kind of use this paradigm as they're thinking and really working through this and say, what are the things that we want to carry down from our normal education? What are the things we want to bring into this middle bucket here from the normal education bucket, from what we were doing a few months ago? And what are the highlights? What are the best things that are happening in this current format? And what do we want to bring with us sort of into the new normal from this current format? One thing I really want to encourage folks to do is to build a plan to use virtual education on a go-forward basis at least a couple of days a year. I think many of you might choose more, and that's okay. But I think I want to encourage folks to use virtual education for the sake of sort of knocking the dust off, if you will, and just making sure that you're equipped to use it. And it's a strategy potentially for snow days. It's a strategy potentially for fire days if you're in California or really anywhere where you have significant fires. It's potentially a strategy for other natural disasters too. It may not always be a solution that you choose for an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado, but it also might be part of the recovery plan. And so I think if we can start to incorporate some of it and on a go-forward basis, we can be a little bit more resilient and a little bit stronger for that experience. And again, that now we're talking not just more than 2 weeks out, but we're maybe even talking a year out. And so I want to be mindful of the fact that that may feel and sound overwhelming right now. And if it does, let's come back to it later. But if it's something you've been thinking about or something you've been talking about with your leadership team, it may be worth starting to incorporate into this sort of process for reopening. The other thing I want to offer is, and this is a fairly rushed illustration, but I want to call out the fact that some of us are going to move from today into a new normal, and it's going to be a fairly easy transition back, or a fairly easy transition to the new normal. And I think some of us are going to hit moments of interference, and whether it's 1 or 7, we don't quite know, and that'll probably be dependent on where in the country you are. And based on that, what the local response is and what the sort of increase in coronavirus cases looks like, and whether there's a reopen and a reclosure, and all of those different layers and challenges that are sort of ahead of us. But I want to call that out again for folks, really, so that you're equipped and prepared for it. It's going to happen. It's something that we have to expect in at least some of our communities. And so if we're mindful of it now, if we can incorporate it into our thinking, again, I think we can be stronger and more resilient for it. So if you are finding yourself moving toward reopening and you're aiming to reopen this year, and many of you, and I'll jump over to the chat because I've seen some messages about this already. Many of you have already made the decision that you're going to stay closed through the year, and that's totally okay. Many of you that have made that decision may choose not to stick to that, right? May choose to sort of say, well, we're going to come back a little bit sooner. And then of course, many of you haven't made the decision yet, or many of you have said you are going to come back, and we just need to all be sort of flexible in that way. But here's what I would say: if you're thinking about reopening this year, this is probably the week to switch back. When we started, we were kind of in this like sprint where we were doing 2 or 3 or 4 meetings a day, figuring out how to launch tech and how to launch the different systems and how to manage things. And then we shifted into this kind of marathon pace where now we're just checking in a little bit more routinely, at least for many of us. Well, this might be the time to kind of move back into that jog pace. So we might get into a daily or an every other day conversation. We're hopefully starting to think about strategizing, communicating, and what would it look like to tell folks that we're coming back to school, but what would it also look like to get back to school and then go back to a virtual environment. And then of course, there are still some things that we will not be able to do. This is not my statement. I want to be clear. I don't get to make that decision for you or with you even. But there are things that our governors and our mayors and our other governmental folks will probably not let us do, such as graduation and moving up ceremonies. And so as part of this sort of thinking about reopening, I would encourage you to think up front about those events, graduation and similar, both because I think it's worth including those in our initial messaging if we can, and also because I think we want to be thoughtful and careful about any mixed messaging that we might be sending. And so to really incorporate that from the very get-go into our thinking, I think will help ensure that we have the best possible communication plan and strategy forward. And I would also say, if you're not planning to reopen this year or not aiming to reopen this year, your pace is probably just fine. And this is kind of the beginning of where we're going to start to see a divergence, even on this call, where some folks are going to be moving at a much quicker clip trying to get folks back to school, and others are going to be able to stay sort of moving at the marathon pace, for lack of a better way to put it, through the spring. And I want to name that for you. I want to name that for us. And we're going to try to sort of straddle both of those areas and make sure that we support both of those areas. For today, though, it's a fairly light lift, and you essentially just would keep doing what you're doing now. The last piece I want to say before I jump into questions is, regardless of when you open, whether that's tomorrow, in 6 months, in 2 months, I think that the most successful tech teams, and therefore the most successful schools, will immediately begin crafting a plan for switching back to virtual learning. Whether there's a second curve, or whether there's another challenge, or whether there's another pandemic, or whether there's another issue, I think it's a realistic scenario, at least, that we might find ourselves doing virtual education again. And so those who are capable of quickly moving back to a virtual education model, and those who do so in a way that's even better than what you're experiencing right now, I think are going to be the most successful in the long term. And frankly, I think a lot of schools have talked to us about how to engage parents, and parents that have questions about what they're paying for, or what services are being provided, and what have you. And we're going to stay carefully out of that lane. But I do think that there's an opportunity to talk about the work that you're doing to ensure an even better experience next year, in the event that we have to repeat a similar sort of virtual spin up as we did just a couple of weeks ago. So again, I would offer that as something that I hope that each of you will kind of wrap into your thinking and challenge your tech teams to do as soon as we go back to, quote unquote, some form of new normal. I'm going to jump into questions, and then we have a couple more slides as well. So I just want to make sure that we sort of straddle both of those too. Let's see. Howard, great. Thanks for being here. Annie, that's a great question. So Annie's question is, how can we support our school communities, staff, students, seniors, parents, guardians? This is going on longer than we thought. It's a constant process of working through the stages of grief, and it just sort of keeps cycling through. And Annie, I think you're totally right. I think we're finding maybe a 2-week span where the start of, if you start on day one of that, there's this really big sort of need within a whole community, and then it seems to fizzle out over the course of about 2 weeks, and then something happens, some trigger event. Sometimes we can see it, other times we have no idea what it is. But for some reason, all of a sudden, that 15th day, the community sort of needs extra support again. And so this is maybe not the right way to explain it, but sort of that's yet another curve that we're having to deal with. I would offer that probably the best thing we can do is to keep ourselves in a place where we're ready to respond, and then use the resources that we have. And so, for many of us that have counselors, or that have existing relationships with outside counselors, or organizations that provide that type of support, that may be a good resource. For those of us that don't, oftentimes there are some teachers within the community. They can be the music teacher, the coach, often a head coach, might be a dean, but there are some people within the community that everybody goes to when they're having a bad day. And oftentimes I know who those are as an outside consultant, because they're the people that everybody says, oh, we'll go talk to this person, they'll help, regardless of what might be going on. And so I would encourage you to leverage those folks as much as you can to support the community through. And beyond that, I think this conversation about self-care is really important, and helping others sort of lean into this idea that it's okay to shut the news off. It's okay to shut the phone off for a few minutes or longer, if they can reasonably do that. So I would offer those as some initial strategies, and then maybe sort of seeing what works best from there and sort of following that through a little bit further. How does that sound? Are those things you've already worked through or already tried? I'm going to jump onto another question here. Zoom best practices. Starting to try for a 25-minute. That's great. I love that. So I'm hearing a couple of folks that are saying on the Zoom front or any form of online education front that we're trying to use a 25-minute meeting for a 30-minute slot and a 50-minute meeting for an hour-long slot. And the goal there being to give people back some time in their days, give people some time to use the bathroom, grab a drink, whatever else they might need to do. And I would imagine that also helps some with attention spans. I know our internal meetings at Joffe are always structured like that. There's some setting in Google or something that somebody set once 5 years ago, and nobody knows how to unset it. So that's what we work with. Maybe a little more intentional than that, but not much. So yeah, that's a great idea. I think we're hearing that the shorter timeframes, especially for younger students, are more successful and more sustainable. I do know, and many of our heads shared videos over the course of the last 2 weeks, and one of the trends that I found in all of those videos was there's this meaningful dichotomy between parents who really want more Zoom time and more work to be done, and parents who are like, this is a global pandemic, stop giving my kid work. And I think that's probably apparent in every community. But I would imagine that in each community, one of those might win out. One of those might have a stronger push or at least a higher volume that are requesting that or sort of making that push. And so I would encourage you to sort of check in with your own parent community and see where people are. But at the very least, the shorter meetings tend to be a little bit more successful, especially for younger students and students with unique needs of any sort. Jeff, this is a great question. So there's a lot of conversation around phased approaches, and at the federal level, certainly there's a phased approach. At the local levels, I think we're starting to see governors roll out these phased approaches. And Jeff's question was, should we as a school have a phased approach? And the short answer is probably. And in fact, somebody asked me the question last week on Twitter, I think, if we were going to do a whole webinar on school reopening. And the answer is absolutely. I don't know when. I don't know yet whether it'll make sense for us to do that next week or the following week or in July, frankly. I'm really trying to stick to that 2-week planning timeframe as well. Well, I shouldn't guess because I'm suggesting that nobody should. But at some point we will do a broader conversation and probably a series of conversations around school reopening. We're going to try to start to pepper in some conversation with other schools from other countries and experiences from other countries so that we can start to give some framework and some kind of rough, maybe skeleton outlines as to what that might look like. But we will absolutely lean in and do a bigger conversation. And when we do, I highly suspect that a phased approach of some sort will be part of that response. This is great. And following on to that question, Jeff mentioned the younger kids in particular. Oh, am I getting that right? Yeah. The younger kids in particular, the phased approach, or rather the virtual education is not so good. And so maybe bringing back younger students first, I think that's a very real scenario. There's a world in which we might bring back students on different days. So there are a lot of different scenarios where we might bring folks back a little bit differently. And I think we want to encourage folks when the time is right to at least think about what those audiences might look like. Jeff, thank you. I don't think I need to get tested yet, but I will if I need to. Let's see, Julie, can you see the slides now? Oh, I hope you can. If anybody else is having slide issues, please let me know. I think I haven't heard anybody else with that concern, so I think we should be okay, but Julie, let us know. Evelyn, Yeah, Evelyn, that's a good question. So this is, oh, great news, Julie. So Evelyn's question was, kind of what procedures would we need to put into place if and when we reopen? And I sort of mentioned, or I hinted at this a little bit, but to maybe say it more plainly, for schools that are choosing, well, to the best of my knowledge, nobody's been given permission yet to reopen. And I don't anticipate that anybody will be given permission to reopen in the next 2 weeks. I think we might see that people get the capacity to reopen a couple weeks from now, but I don't think we're going to be starting school this week or next week in any state or in any city. If that's different for you, please share that with me, because I may simply not know of it. But what I think we'll probably see is that when we reopen, that first we'll see some form of faculty staff presence on campus, probably maintaining social distancing, maintaining obviously good hygiene, all those sorts of things. And then probably also with an emphasis on not using common spaces. So whatever room you normally would do your faculty and staff meeting in, whether it's an NPR or something like that, I imagine we probably won't be using those types of spaces. There might be a temperature screening that takes place. I don't have good clarity around whether, if that's going to be a nationwide expectation or if that's going to be a locally driven expectation. There might be some different expectations around cleaning, or actually I think there will be some different expectations around cleaning, specifically frequency of cleaning. So those are some of the kind of categories of change that I think we'll find. We will do a conversation that gets into much more detail around what specifically schools should do in each of those categories. If it is temperature screening, for example, is that everyone? Is it visitors? Is it students? Is it parents? Is it staff? Is it faculty? So we're going to try to answer all of those questions for and with you. But right now, there's not quite enough certainty around when or what will happen when we reopen. And so we don't want to create, there's two things we don't want to do. The first is we don't want to create sort of a false expectation of what is necessary. But second, we don't want to create a situation where we put a ton of planning energy at our level or at schools levels into something and then have it change slightly and have to reinvent the wheel. So I'll give you a couple of scenarios today. I'll jump back in just a minute that I would encourage you to think through, and some questions that I would encourage you to ask, because I think these will really be the building blocks for how we sort of create the plan to reopen. Even though I don't think these are the answers that we come up with to these questions today, I don't think will be the same answers that we come up with a month from now or 3 months from now. I think having asked these questions today will help us think through a little bit more and a little bit more quickly what those answers are going to be for us in the future. Lizette, I think that's a good question. Lizette's question was, is there value in sharing how this has impacted our community if that information is already public? Lizette, I probably would want to get a better sense for what some of the examples that you're thinking of, but yeah, my instinct is if the information is public and there are no privacy restrictions or privacy rules that we would be violating, then yeah, I don't see any reason that we couldn't or shouldn't own the story and sort of tell the story in the way that is appropriate for us. Extended school year. All right, I think we're getting into some of these next scenarios. So I'm going to jump back in. Awesome, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to jump back into, let's see, where are we? A sample leadership team agenda. So this is kind of getting into some of the next steps that I would encourage you to take coming out of today's conversation. And excuse me, just 1 second. All right. So as we sort of look ahead and think a little bit about what our next steps might be, many of you have started to reach out already and say, we're having a leadership meeting, we're having a conversation. And I think, kudos for sort of kicking off the conversation about reopening, now is probably the time to start that conversation. And here's what I think we should be talking about. I think we should probably be talking about a safe and hybrid approach to learning that incorporates social distancing. We've talked about that quite a bit, so I won't reiterate that. I think we've got to talk about cleaning, and I think we want to be mindful and thoughtful about the fact that we are going to have to clean more. I've thrown out this idea that we should talk about cleaning 4 times a day, and not because I think 4 times a day is the expectation, but because I think that's a high enough frequency that it's different than what we were doing before. And so by coming up with a strategy to do that, I think we'll be a little better equipped, a little better prepared to deal with whatever the outcome might be that the CDC recommends. I think we need to think about a unique approach for our own most vulnerable folks. So specifically, our kids and our adults with Crohn's disease, anybody on campus who has HIV, childhood cancer patients, transplant patients, anybody who's over 65 to 70, depending on what state you're in. Different states are suggesting a different age for that sort of increased risk threshold. What are the things that we can or want to do to help support our community as best we can and as thoughtfully as we can? I think that's a really important part of the conversation that we have today, not because I think we need to come up with the answers today, but I think it's really important that we start thinking about that now. What does our fail-safe virtual education look like? How are we engaging parents? And then for so many of us, how are we managing the childcare portion of this? A huge conversation that we've had is this idea that childcare is, in some cases, fundamentally the most important thing that we can do for families. And so one scenario, and again, this is not within the realm of possibility yet. But one scenario might be that we have small groups of students that come together at a specific parent's house who's not working outside the home. And those groups are up to 5 or up to 10. We're talking small, consistent groups of kids. And those groups might be safe to come together on a regular basis. And again, the goal of that would be small, consistent groups. So probably no more than 10, possibly no more than 5. And nobody has the authority to do that yet or the authorization to do that yet. I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting you can do this tomorrow, but it's possible that in the future that would be part of our social distancing expectations or part of our new normal in the event that we need to shift back into a virtual learning environment. And the goal there would be, if we have 4 parents out of a group of 5 that are working outside the home or that are essential personnel or that simply can't handle sort of education and childcare while they're doing whatever else they might need to do, then that might be a strategy to help provide for childcare, keep those students in our community, and also keep really good supervision for those kids, because that may be really important too. And then I think there's a conversation, again, still amongst the leadership team around our pressure points. What are the things that will cause us to reopen? What are the things that will cause us to reclose? What are our limits? What are our criteria for making these decisions? Is it based on what independent schools or charter schools in our neighborhood are doing? Is it based on the district? Is it based on what an association is telling us? Is it based on only having a positive test result? And again, I'm not sure that we quite need to get to an answer to these today, but to start a conversation and really get clear within our leadership teams about what our boundaries are, I think is really, really important. And then last but not least, I think it's also necessary to address what our own limitations are in all of this. I have kids of my own and I can't participate in this XYZ, or I have folks that live with me that I need to care for, and so this XYZ scenario won't work for me. I think it's really important that we get clear about those and sort of acknowledge those for ourselves and then as a leadership team. I'm not sure that needs to expand to the entire faculty and staff. For some it might, but at the very least, I think it's critical that at the leadership team, we're clear about what those are. This is another little exercise, and this is the goal of this was to illustrate a whiteboard and a few questions and some Post-its. But this might be worth conducting either for your leadership team. By the way, this should be a virtual whiteboard. But it might be worth doing this for your leadership team, maybe even for the full faculty and staff. And some communities that I've talked to, actually, the idea of this came from a community that went so far as to ask everybody in the community what these questions. So the idea is, what was normal? And so they threw out a few things. They said why, and they really dug into the why behind those answers. So was that because it's the way we have always done it? Was that because it had a really good teaching and learning outcome? Was that because X, Y, Z? And then based on that, they sort of jumped into this dialogue around what we're bringing with us. What will be normal? What will we take with us into the future? And what, if anything, will we really intentionally choose to leave behind? And I think one of the pieces of power that comes with asking and answering that question, regardless of which community audience you choose to engage in it, is people in a pandemic, in an emergency, people are feeling a lack of control, and people are feeling a lack of choice and a lack of opportunity to make their own decisions. And that can be really overwhelming and scary to some, especially our leaders. And so one of the ways that we can combat that is to create the opportunity for choice, create the opportunity for decisions, and sort of work through those things together. And it's not to say that everything that somebody sticks on a Post-it and puts up on that section is going to disappear, but it is to give people an opportunity to influence and believe that they've influenced what's happening. Of course, that only works if you are authentically asking that question. So, there's a trade-off there. But that's a strategy that worked for one school when they asked the entire community these questions. And so I wanted to share it with you. I would also offer, and this is maybe a overstepping, but monkey bars are something that I personally don't like for a variety of safety reasons. So if there are things like that you want to sort of leave behind, this is certainly a potential opportunity to do that. And again, you want to be authentic about how you're approaching this, but you can use your version of the red herring monkey bars and potentially step away from that as you move forward into the future and into this new normal with your community. I'm going to put this up. This is the same slide you saw last week. So really, I won't dig deeply into it, but I want to just call out the two potential scenarios or two of the many potential scenarios. And some of the questions that I really want to encourage you to be asking, again, this would probably be as part of that leadership team meeting. Could you develop a schedule where you actually extended the day of the school day, or you extended the school year enough so that you could have smaller groups of students in any given space? Is that possible? Is it possible to eliminate indoor or outdoor play? Who are the students who are best engaged and best served through digital education? Who are least served? And could we actually manage a hybrid scenario where those who are best served could be served that way digitally, and those who are not being served sufficiently could be served through on-campus education? Is that a scenario that could reduce the number of people in a space? The next step to each of these questions I would ask is that something that you would have to trigger now? Or is that something that you might be able to trigger mid-year? Is it practical to say that we could start the school year as close to normally as we might normally, for lack of a better way to put that, and then that if we needed to, we could kind of fail back to a scenario using some of these answers to these questions? I would encourage folks to start asking these questions, and again, not because today's answers are going to be the answers you stick with, but because I think it's these types of questions that push thinking and that really scaffold us toward being able to answer the questions the way that we'll need to next year or when we reopen, whether that's in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So again, the purpose is not to say these are the only scenarios. It's also not to say that today's answers are going to be the answers you go with, but it is to say in a world where we're trying to create this social distancing, kind of create classrooms that look more like this one on the right than on the left, what are the ways that we might be able to cause that to happen logistically? And then when are the trigger points for that? When do we have to make the decisions so that we actually get to sort of lean into those or live those potential new normals? I'm going to jump back into the question panel here. I recognize we only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure that I cover any of the big questions here. Dave, yes. Oh, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. I apologize. I will share a copy of the slides as well as a copy of the recording with every single person on this call. We'll also share that with folks who RSVP'd but didn't make it today, and those will come out a little bit later today. We've been sending them out between 5 and 6 p.m., I think, so we're going to try to stick to that roughly, but they will be out later today. Thor, and I saw this question somewhere else. The temperature screenings are a big topic right now. So a little bit of guidance around these. First, you're probably within your rights. No matter what, you need to check in with your local council to make sure that this is true. But you're probably within your rights right now to do temperature screening for all essential personnel who come to work. So there are kind of 4 groups that we would consider essential personnel for most schools: facilities, security, the business office, and the tech team. So those 4 groups, and ideally you'd have those 4 groups subdivided further into team 1, team 2, team 3, or some kind of subdivision so that they were more resilient. So those folks you may be able to go ahead and screen for, or likely can go ahead and screen for right now. The challenges that exist, though, are real. Temperature is not necessarily the first indicator of a diagnosis. There are definitely employment law questions, there are privacy law questions around when students return to school, whether or not we can include them in this. So there are lots and lots and lots of layers to this. And so what I would say is right now, it's probably okay for you to do that. Again, check with your local council and make sure that they agree. But you can probably screen at least the essential personnel that are coming to campus right now. And then let's talk again a couple weeks from now about what the sort of new normal is for us nationwide around that question, because it's ultimately not going to be our decision at Joffe whether or not you do that. It's going to be probably a government decision supported by OSHA and some of the other government branches, and then we will help you figure out how to sort of operationalize it. So again, I know that's a really complex question. I'll tell you, the conversation came up last week on the call, and coming out of the call, we talked to 2 different lawyers in 2 different parts of the country, 2 different answers. And so we want to be really, really methodical about how we share that information. And for right now, I would say check with your local council, manage it in the now, and then let's address the later a little bit later. Really good questions, though. I just saw something that came in that caught my eye. Yeah, Annie, we'd love to take that recommendation. Stephen, this is a great idea. All right, I'm going to come back to Stephen's idea in just a second because it's a great one. What I want to do last, for those of you that are going to jump away from us, is I want to take just a second to take another deep breath. This was Joel's recommendation a couple weeks ago, and I think it's a worthwhile one to try to end our conversation with that same deep breath. So let's go ahead and do that together. And in terms of next steps and follow-up, a quick reminder for those that joined a few minutes late, we will be sending out weekly email Thursdays or Fridays. We're going to keep doing this call weekly on Mondays at 9 a.m. Pacific. You can follow me on Twitter for more frequent updates. And you can also send questions to support@joffeeemergencyservices.com. We will try to answer those questions in minutes or hours. And at the very worst, we will answer any question that you ask by Sunday on Monday, and any question that you ask by Wednesday on Thursday, or during that subsequent email that goes out later in the week. There's one last ask I have of everybody, and I know I've shared this out a couple times, so for those that have completed it, thank you. For those that have not yet, if you have 3 minutes to spare. We are redefining how Joffe is going to work with schools next year, and your answers on this survey are really, really valuable to us. As everybody else sort of contemplates their new normal, we're doing just the same. You'll see it's a fairly open-ended survey, but it'll only take you about 3 minutes. Right now, we've got about 50 responses. We're trying to get up to about maybe 300, 350 responses from schools around the country. And so if you can spare a few minutes to fill that out, we would so greatly appreciate it. Other than that, for those that need to jump off, I hope you have a great, healthy, and safe and productive rest of the week. We'll see you again next Monday. And for those that would like to stick around, there are a couple other questions that I'm going to keep digging into. So thanks for those who need to go, and let's jump back in. Stephen, let's see, I wanted to go to your question because it stuck out to me. Where was the first part of it? There we go. Okay. So Stephen's considering a split schedule for reopening with social distancing, wary of an extended day with different groups morning and afternoon, and concerned about the sort of complete disinfecting of the entire campus in the chunk of time between sessions. So they've restricted their planning to separate days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for younger students, Tuesday, Thursday for older students. Kudos to you for the thought that you've put into that. You can tell sort of from that approach how much has already gone into it. Oh, rats, Stephen, I missed your statement. At any rate, so the question was, is there a streamlined way to disinfect the campus that might take a half hour or less and might make it possible for people to do a morning and an afternoon? Ultimately, it's going to depend on what the CDC guidelines require. Probably there would be some form of kind of quick cleaning that could take place if you had sufficient staff to do it. What I would start with and prioritize from a thinking and planning process is how big is campus and how long does a traditional quote unquote deep clean take? And then what if you added 2 more people, or what if you doubled the staff that's doing that cleaning? How much longer would that take? And then I would also, maybe even go so far as to think who else on campus? If you have a specific group of custodians that are doing the cleaning, what if you added facilities to help with the cleaning for that midday push? Or what if there were a group of casual labor folks, whether they were some other type of worker, teachers, coaches, security, who might be available to help support that process, to help accelerate it? That might be a worthwhile brainstorming session. I haven't thought about the challenges that go along with that, so I'm not sure that's a good idea. But at least maybe a direction to go in. What if we increase that population so that we could go a little bit faster? So I think that's probably where I would start. The second thing I would say is it's easy to limit ourselves based on what we would consider the normal span of the day. Maybe our normal span is from 7:45 to 4:30, or from 7:30 to 3, or whatever our faculty contracts say for this year. What if we flipped that a little bit too? And again, I don't know the details of your community, so whether or not this is practical, you will obviously know better than I. But what if we extended a lunch break, or shifted the day so that it were 7:30 to 5? Could we actually buy ourselves an extra half hour to do that cleaning? So we didn't just have 30 minutes, but a total of an hour in the middle of the day to do that cleaning. That would be another direction that I would probably try to push. Again, I think it's natural that we're kind of operating from the confines of our historical boundaries and guidelines. And so what of those are we able to step away from versus what can't we? And I would, once you've asked that question, kind of worked through this, I think those might be some of the things that come up. Oh, this is awesome. Thank you, Debbie. I'm going to drop this directly in the chat. For those that are looking at the pandemic temperatures and sort of that whole conversation, the EEOC has put together a specific set of recommendations around this. I have not looked at this link today. So that's it. We know Debbie, so I'm pretty sure it's a good one. This specifically talks about what the US federal government will allow or will sort of support. Obviously, there are going to be some differences at the local level, and so it's still so critically important that you go to your lawyers and have the conversation directly. That said, maybe consider even taking this with you so that you can have all of the facts all out on the table as you have the conversation. And of course, when I say take this with you, I mean virtually. Chire, this is a great, hi Chire, I haven't seen you for a little bit. Great to see you. Thanks for joining the call today. So Chire's question is, there's some sort of ultraviolet light fogging that uses some sodium-based solution. What is that? I don't specifically know what that is, but I do know that there are a few. There's electrostatic cleaning that's now being done, which may be similar to that. I know of some like sort of fumigation-like, almost like if you have pets and you were to use a flea bomb, sort of like that. I'm not sure that those are, anyway, I'm not gonna go there. Almost like that you might be able to use in a specific space. So I've seen a lot of different measures that people are starting to use. I don't know specifically what the schools in Connecticut were using, but we'll find out for you. Just gonna jot that down. And then I would also say that as we get a little bit further into May and some of that cleaning work that's going to need to take place, we will absolutely share that. I know there are also questions about air filters and you know, air conditioning, heating units, all that type of sort of facilities level stuff. We will absolutely dig into that. So stay tuned to be sure. Kelly, great question. Social distancing on a playground. Yes, we will cover that. I'm not sure that we would have, but I will make sure that we do cover that when we get back, or before we get back, I should say. Just jotting myself a note there. Thank you for that. Colleen, there is, I actually don't know if there's a webpage with past meetings saved. I will see if there is. If there is, I'll drop it in the link that we send out in the email today. If not, we may be able to make one. I'll find out for you. That's a good question, Colleen. Thanks for that. Annie, that great statement. I don't know what the equitable way to approach this conversation is, but there are 3 long lead time items that it may make sense for schools to go out and purchase today. And those 3 start with thermometers for the off chance that we may, or the on chance maybe that we may need to use them as either part of our essential worker screening or part of our student screening. Specifically, we generally recommend going with an infrared thermometer to keep social distancing as high as it can possibly be. You might also consider having an ear thermometer or something else that's a little bit more accurate, a touch thermometer of some sort that's a little bit more accurate for anybody who does test with a high temperature. And for quantities there, by the way, I think for most schools, you probably are talking like 3 to 6 of these. So I'm not talking dozens or hundreds, certainly, but a few, so that if a battery dies or one walks away, it's amazing how quickly these things grow legs, that you have some backups in place so that we're not looking at a full shutdown because we don't have the measures that we've committed to. So that's item number 1. Item number 2 is gloves and hand sanitizer and soap, of course. Kind of that bucket of things. How do we keep our hands and ourselves clean? Probably not talking thousands of gloves, probably talking hundreds of gloves, maybe 10 boxes or so, which is generally about 500, some different sizes. And again, the goal there is to have them available. Not quite sure what we're going to use them for yet. Maybe as part of the temperature screening, maybe as part of the pickup and drop off line if we maintain some form of that. You know, we don't anticipate that those are going to be in really, really high demand or that they'll be short stocked because there's so many different sources for those. And then the last and the most, maybe the least equitable to purchase right now, but I'll share the information. You can do with it as you wish. Is N95 masks and masks in general. I don't think there's a world where people are coming back and using N95 masks for every student or every adult. It's possible, but I don't see that as one of the scenarios that we use. But I do see temperature screening, or maybe even just a non-temperature but welcome screening, where we ask questions like, who have you been exposed to, who's in the community, what have you been out to eat over the weekend, things like that, that we might ask people on their way into campus on a Monday or throughout the week even. Any of those types of scenarios, we may find that we need to have the people who are doing that screening wearing an N95 mask or a regular mask. So I think it's probably a good idea to have at least 50 to 200 N95 masks, and somewhere around half of your community size of regular masks, non-N95 masks. And those don't have to be surgical masks. They could be the hand-built ones that we're seeing from around the country that different people are creating. But I think we probably want to have a few of those available as well. So again, I know there's a lot of question around whether it's okay to go out and purchase N95 masks. I will tell you that when and if they need to be available to you, we will try to make some available to you. Our experience has been a little bit different than what I've seen in the news. We've been able to continue to purchase N95 masks for our EMTs in the event safety division. And so I would offer that if and when you need some, we will do everything we can to help make them available to you. I actually just discovered that last week, so we'll keep you posted there. I'm seeing a lot of the teachers do not want to extend the school year. That is fair. Oh, Chire, I misunderstood the ULV. So what we were talking about earlier, those cleaning tools that they were using in Connecticut, they are ultra low volume, not ultraviolet light. So it looks like foggers are available for a few $100s each. That's really interesting. Maureen has a Clorox 360 electrostatic cleaning machine that our cleaning company has been using. It's Redcoats Cleaning for those that are in the Washington, DC area, and it takes them only about an hour to do every classroom and office. It's a sprayer. That is awesome to know. Oh, okay, and the school is relatively small, so, well, maybe not so small, 20,000 square feet, 3 grades, 4 grades. So mid-size, small and mid-size at least. That's very interesting. Thank you, Maureen. I'm just jumping back through. All right, I think we've gotten to most of these questions. There are definitely some good questions still around the idea of reopening, and so I want to just share it with everybody. We will absolutely do our best to answer those questions ahead of when you need the answers. I know for many you would like the answers today, and I would love to have the answers for you today. We just don't yet, and so I want to make sure that when we answer those questions that we are as informed as we can be. I realize that things may change, right? And so anytime we give a recommendation, in fact, just a month ago, we were talking about masks and said, folks don't need to necessarily wear them. And there was good evidence and good supporting logic behind that. And then in just a matter of a couple of weeks, that changed. So anytime we give a recommendation, of course, it could always shift and change. But right now, even our best guess would be a relatively educated guess. And we want to do better for you, and we know we can do better for you. So we're going to hold those answers until we have a little bit more information from the community as a whole. I think what I'll do is we'll stop there. For those that have other specific questions, we'll certainly try to get back to you later on today. Please don't hesitate to keep reaching out through email, through Twitter, or anywhere else to ask questions. And remember, when you're facing a challenge, whether it's huge and feels like it's impacting the entire community, or one that's just in your own hands, take a deep breath first, and we hope that that will give you the strength to work your way through it and to stay as strong and capable as possible. So as always, thank you for joining this conversation. Hope you have a healthy and safe week, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday. Thanks, everyone. Chire, for those that are still on the line, you're welcome to stick around for this, but I want to just comment, I'm seeing a couple questions that are last questions before we jump. Chire asked about what Maureen School was using, and that is a Clorox 360 cleaning machine. It's an electrostatic cleaning machine that their cleaning company has been using. I don't necessarily want to send everybody to call Redcoats Cleaning, but I'm sure we'll get some more information from Maureen. It looks like it's the Clorox 360 electrostatic machine, which I believe I've seen. Oh, and there it is. I'm gonna just drop this out for, let's see, was that for John? Oh no, that was for Chiri. Oh, thank you, Chiri. And then John had asked a question. We just dropped the eval form in the chat for everybody again. All right, I think that'll do it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.